Locomotives come in all shapes, sizes, colors, and designs. There really is no specific designation on what counts as one of these. But sometimes, when we look at certain prototypes, we'll often think that they are maybe just a car or something on rails. Today's topic for this documentary will be covering something called the Galloping Goose. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably not a rail fan like me, so you're probably thinking, what on earth are you talking about? What is this Galloping Goose you were talking about? Well, let's take a look at the footage real fast. Once we get through that locomotive, you will see what the Galloping Goose is. Do you see that silver thing right there? That is called a Galloping Goose, specifically goose number 7. And today we are going to talk about that specific goose. To make a long story short, due to the fact that we are on a time budget, the Galloping Geese were created in the 1930s by the Rio Grande Southern Railroad. The idea of the locomotives was to be able to have something that could carry passengers, freight, and even the mail in a timely fashion, but to reduce the cost of the railroad at hand. A steam locomotive will often take about a lot of money to run. You have to pay the driver, you have to pay the fireman, and you have to pay the conductor for the caboose. Not to mention the upkeep of trying to keep the locomotive going, as well as maintaining the passengers, cars, and freight cars themselves as well. Obviously, with the Galloping Geese, they were much cheaper to run. After all, it was just a part car, part bus. And they simply had to build a boxcar to be able to carry that freight and that mail all around the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, specifically where Durango and many other cities surrounding it are now. In terms of what was needed back then, the Galloping Geese only needed one driver to handle the entire train. In fact, there was no train running behind the Galloping Goose. All they needed was just one Galloping Goose rail car to run operations. So successful were these unusual rail cars that eventually the Rio Grande Southern was able to pay off its debts by the end of the 1930s. However, the debt in question ended up not being enough to save the railway's fortune. By the end of World War II and the start of the 1950s, highways and various paved roads began to overtake the city of Durango and various other locations in the San Juan Mountains, resulting in the railroad not being able to be of use anymore. The biggest and final killer, or nail in the coffin as some would say, is that the United States Postal Service declined to renew the contract of the Rio Grande Southern Railroad, taking away the final element that they needed to be able to keep operations going for the communities that they served. Eventually, by 1950, it was decided that all Goose rail cars would have their boxcars converted into being able to carry passengers, and the line would attempt to serve itself as a tourist line. This eventually did not last, and in 1952, the Rio Grande Southern was no more. The final duties of the Galloping Goose rail cars was to be able to pull up all of the rail lines that they had once served for almost 20 years. Notably, in the terms of railway and railroad preservation, all 7 members of the Galloping Geese survived. Well, technically, 6 of them survived. Number 1 was scrapped in 1933 and is now simply a replica that runs around. But the original 6 Galloping Geese that still remain are still with us today. You can find them all over various parts of Colorado. In fact, you can actually find goose number 3 in Knott's Berry Farm, over in Southern California. Though they may be quite unusual at the end of the day, the Galloping Geese really have served their purpose in this world. A true Colorado original, the Galloping Geese may not be the best, or the fastest, or the strongest at all, but they really have cemented their place in history, in Colorado's railroad history, as truly Colorado originals.
Yeah, that woke me up.